Let's get started.
Recording, go.
All right. Guys, just a bit of a summary from yesterday. This stuff is a little confusing because it keeps contradicting itself. And the reason it does is that it keeps giving evidence when it found something conflictory with Rav Yochanan and Rav Elazar. So what happens is it said, okay, this is the point of view, but this is how you can interpret the point of view. No, but what about this and what about that? So all you have to do is you need to concentrate here fully, otherwise you're going to miss out. The whole goal is not to have to listen to the shir again. Okay, that's the entire goal.
Okay.
So first thing we learned, just quickly in summary, that Rav Elazar quoted in the name of Rav Yishmael that there are two things that are not in a person's possession, but they're treated as though they were in his possession. What does it mean they're treated as if they're in his possession? The Torah still places responsibility upon the person, even if the item doesn't belong to him. Okay? So like a pit in the public domain, it doesn't belong to you, but there's still liability if you create it. It's the same thing with so of these two things, the one is a pit that is dug in the public domain, and the other one is chametz after 6 hours. Why do we say that? It's because you sell ownership and you say we have no chametz in our possession, but you can't derive benefit from it. And if you actually consume it, it's kares. So even though you no longer own it, you're still liable for the spiritual responsibility of it as the same as a pit. So he's quoting Rav Yishmael. Now we don't know at this point if he holds the same view as Rav Yishmael. Who was Rav Yishmael? Rav Yishmael was Rav Elazar's teacher. So we don't know yet if he holds the same view as his teacher or he doesn't hold the same view. In most times, the students did hold the same view as their teacher, in most cases. So we don't know that yet. So far, what is this evidence for? That one is liable for an ownerless pit, just like one is liable for one's ownerless chametz if you consume it or you derive benefit from it. Okay, so that's how it started off. Then what happened then? It was a second Mishnah in the 30th daf. Then the Mishnah says, not Rav Elazar, if one turns over dung in the public domain and then another person was damaged by it, the one who was turning it over is liable to pay for his damage. So Rav Elazar's explanation of the Mishnah is they taught he is only liable where he intended to acquire the dung. But where he did not intend to acquire it, he is not liable. So now, evidently, this is saying that Rav Elazar maintains that a person isn't responsible for a hazard he left in the public domain unless he owns it, which seems to contradict the previous statement of him quoting his teacher Rav Yishmael. So now we have a bit of a problem. We've got a dichotomy. So it seems that one who declares his hazard's ownerless is not liable according to Rav Elazar. So right, there's a big question mark. So the Gemara says no. In fact, Rav Elazar rules that one who declares his hazard's ownerless is liable, as it had asserted originally. But the case involving the dung is an exception to this. So why is it an exception? Is because Rav Ada bar Ava said that Rav Elazar maintains that the Mishnah speaks of a case where he basically put the dung back in its original position. So you're not liable unless you acquire it because the hazard wasn't created through his actions. What do we mean? Well, very simple. There's a person there dumps it. Gav, this was to answer your question yesterday. We did touch on it. Is that you can't be held accountable for an obstacle in the public domain if you never created that obstacle to start with. So all you're doing here is you're lifting it up, you're looking at it, and you're putting it down in the exact position that it damaged, and therefore you never created anything new. Okay, so the Gemara then wants to get evidence for this, and it gets that from Ravina, because Ravina said to Rav Ada bar Ava's case, to what can the matter be compared? It can be compared to one who finds an open pit and covers it, and then uncovers it again. So you're not liable for any subsequent damage because he didn't create the pit in the first place. So then the Gemara disputes the analogy. Why? Because basically Marzutra, the son of Rav Mari, turns around to him and says, listen, these cases are not alike. In the case of you've got a, what do you call it, a manhole and a pit cover. The first deed, the digging of the pit, wasn't undone. All you've done is you've covered it with a manhole. Then afterwards you changed your mind and you took off the manhole. So in that case, we can understand why the second person isn't responsible. Why? Because he didn't dig the ditch in the first place. The only time you're responsible is like this case of the dung. Why? At this point, there was a hazard. You lifted up the dung. Now, had you taken the dung away with the spade, there would no longer be a hazard. You removed it. The very fact that you dumped it back, you created a new hazard. So Rav Zutra, the son of Rav Mani, doesn't agree. He doesn't agree with Ravina that the case is analogous. Okay? Because, so then, basically, having rejected the previous approach, the Gemara says, all right, maybe there's a different explanation of why Rav Elazar limited the Mishnah to a case where he acquired the dung. So it seems like we don't have clarity on that issue. We've got Ravina, we've got Rav Zutra, the son of Rav Mari, and they've both got conflicting opinions in Rav Elazar's explanation. So now we're going to Rav Ashi. So according to Rav Ashi, Rav Elazar maintains that the Mishnah speaks of a case where he turns over the dung less than 3 tefachim from the ground. Now, why is it significant, guys, very quickly, if it's less than 3 tefachim from the ground? There's two reasons. What are the two reasons we discussed yesterday?
Guys, you want to go for it?
I think, isn't it less than 3 tefachim, no one would be liable for damages or death? We did that a long time ago. Or it's not, it's
Yes, I agree with you.
And he can't acquire it if it's over 3 tefachim. He can't make the acquisition.
Okay, you're almost there. You're almost there. Any suggestions, Gus?
Okay. Arthur? All right, I'm going to give it a shot. I only know one thing that I remember
but you've
from yesterday.
done prep on the duff. You've done prep.
Kevin, go. I'm waiting for him. Kevin says he got one thing.
No, you go first.
No, you go first. You're a coward.
Okay.
All right.
That always happens. Courtesy happens when the other person doesn't know the answer. Go for it.
Of course.
Just dive in, guys. Come. We're running out of time. Come.
Yeah, all right, quickly. Okay, so if you lifted more than 3, then it's considered as if you've actually moved the like you've acquired it. So you've acquired
Gavin answered both the answers, but he merged them together. Excellent, Gavin. Excellent.
Right.
So the one possible answer is that for sure you make hagba, you acquire it if it's above 3 tefachim, and therefore if you acquire it, it goes under the category of shor. You're always responsible for your property that damages in the public domain. Always, even for utensils. So that would now go under shor. Or owned property, which would still go under the category of shor. That's according to Rav. According to Shmuel, whether it's ownerless or not, you're liable. So Gavin's right in that perspective. He's also right from the fact that if it's above 3 tefachim, you now have created a new hazard, because under 3 tefachim, you haven't moved it from its original position. What is defined as a new position? Well, if you just lift it up a little bit, that's not changing the position, because if you lying on the ground and you're lifting up poop with a spade, apart from the fact that they'll lock you up at Sterkfontein mental ward for examining the poop of some donkey, if you don't get hit by the bucky that goes past and you're lucky enough not to get put out of your misery, then what happens is the bucky will still be able to drive over that poop from its original position. And therefore, you haven't created any new hazard. It's the old hazard. So for both those reasons, Gavin, excellent. All right. Now let's go on quickly. So the Gemara says, but what forced Rav Elazar to interpret this referring to a case where he turned over the dung less than 3 tefachim from the ground? In other words, to say the reason why he's liable is that he intended to acquire the dung. But if he didn't acquire it, he's not liable. So Rav Elazar basically interprets the Mishnah as referring to a case where he turned over the dung above 3 tefachim from the ground. So therefore, he didn't acquire it, and so he would be liable for those two reasons. So Rav Ashi brings, Rava now says, listen, what's the reason why it's less than 3 tefachim? It said because Rav Elazar was bothered by the wording. It said in the Mishnah, the wording in the Mishnah is clear. It said he turned over the dung. Rav Elazar can't reword the Mishnah. It's not he raised up the dung, he turned it over. And therefore, if you take a spade and you quickly turn it over in the same position that the hazard, Kevin, are you with me? In the same position where the dung was originally, if you just take the spade and turn it over, you haven't created it new. Yeah. So whoever left that dung there in the first place is responsible. Then you haven't acquired it either, and therefore it doesn't become a shore, or you're not liable for it either. So on those two grounds, it has to stay within the integrity of the Mishnah. It says he turned over the dung. It doesn't say he raised the dung. So that's why Rav Elazar said it has to be on point of below 3 tefachim. So now the Gemara maintains at this stage that Rav Elazar imposes responsibility for ownerless hazards. Okay? It was stated above that Rav Yochanan and Rav Elazar disagree over this issue. So what are we saying? We're saying very, very clear. Is that it's that issue of the dung was now resolved. So now it's going to go back to Rav Elazar's original point. And his point is he was quoting Rav Yishmael, his teacher, and saying, listen, two ownerless things you're responsible for. A pit in the public domain and chametz. So therefore, that question reasserts itself, right? So now we're a bit bothered because we're saying, hang on a second, but if that's the case, then it must be, the kibber's about to join. Now we're at a bit of a confused state because we've gone backwards and forwards with who's responsible. So now the only explanation is that it would seem that Rav Yochanan was the one who said, you're not liable for this hazard that is ownerless. All right, but guys, something should be a little bit wrong here. And one of the things that should give you a clue is that when Rav Yochanan mentioned Rav Yehuda's opinion, he was of the opinion that Rav Yehuda would say that in the case of an ownerless hazard, if it's qualifiable, it means you are responsible only when there was an unavoidable accident where you slipped and tripped or it disintegrated in your hand, that in that particular case, you could declare the hazard ownerless and not be responsible. But any other time that the hazard was ownerless, you would be liable. So that should tell you that something is wrong now, when the Gemara is probably proposing that Rav Yochanan was the one that says you're not liable for a hazard that's ownerless. Can you see what I'm saying? So when you do a lot of reading of the same daf, you'll start to pick up intuitions like this. All right, so let's go on. Let's going to try and prove the case. So we have learned in the Mishnah that Rav Yochanan says, if one hides a thorn or a shard of glass in the public domain, or if one makes his fence, which abuts on the public domain, out of thorns, or a fence fell into the public domain and another person is damaged by them. In other words, any one of these hazards, guys, the owner of the hazard is liable to pay for his damage. Now, this was in the Mishnah. So now Rav Yochanan said in explanation of the case involving a fence of thorns, and we're going to read this Mishnah in the 30th daf. They taught that one who makes a fence out of thorns is liable only when he projected the thorns into the public domain, but if he confines the thorns within his own property, he is not liable. Okay, Kev, do you want me to repeat this, or can you give it to me in summation?
Yeah, I'm a bit tight today.
Okay,
I had a very
there's no.
yeah. Can you? Yeah. I know it. I'm just.
There's no. Listen.
My mind's drifting back and forth.
I can see, but there's no criticism. Nobody's getting criticized for fatigue.
No, it's fine. I'm just very tired, so it's not like yesterday.
So fine. Let me just repeat the sentence again. I just need a few minutes from you, Kev. We don't have long to go. So in the Mishnah in the 30th daf in Aleph, there are two Mishnahs in Aleph in the 30th daf. But the first one says if one hides a thorn or a shard of glass in the public domain, or you make your fence out of thorns, or a fence fell into the public domain and another person is damaged by them, the owner of the hazards is liable to pay for his damage. That's the Mishnah. Okay. So Kevin, now Rav Yochanan said in explanation of this case that that a person that makes a fence out of thorns is only liable when he projected the thorns into the public domain. But if he confined the thorns within his own property, he is not liable. So let me just ask you guys something here. If Rav Yochanan said he's liable if he projects the thorns into the public domain, what is this trying to prove?
Want me to go?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so what he's trying to say is that if it's on your property, it's unusual for somebody to go rub up against your property fence. Okay, therefore the guy's exempt. But if it's in the public domain, where somebody can get hurt, then he is responsible.
Okay,
you have to be careful.
I can see that you've done prep, but you about 4 paragraphs ahead. But I want you to address this issue now. So the question I'm trying to ask you is this explanation actually would not seem to suggest that Rav Yochanan said he is not liable. Because if Rav Yochanan said, listen, I'm putting a fence in the public domain and then you're liable. If the fence is in my property, I'm not liable. Why is it not liable in my property? What are you doing in my property? If you scale the wall and land up in my property and scale my fence, the fence is mine. In other words, it's my property you're scaling and my property is mine. So therefore you have no right to enter. So of course I'm not liable if you try and break in my place. But if you get injured on the fence that I'm putting in the public domain, I am liable. So this, upon initial reading, doesn't make sense because this was seeming to be a proof to show that Rav Yochanan said that an ownerless hazard is not liable. Does that make sense, guys? Can you see the problem?
Yeah, very nice, Damon.
So what, Akiva, you might...
I think, Damon...
Yeah, I'm listening.
If he puts a fence in the public domain, it's not really so ownerless because it's...
Excellent.
It belongs to an owner.
That's what I was waiting for. That's exactly what I was waiting for.
The sides of the fence might be on his property, so that's why also what Akiva said. So that's why
no.
Part of the fence might be.
Akiva is saying that the side that's in the public domain, he still owns the fence, and therefore he's liable because it's his fence he owns. So it's like it's like his own property. If your property, like your bull, damages utensils or scratches a person or injures, you're liable under the case of. Sure, according to Rav, and according to Rav Shmuel, you're still responsible for ownerless hazard. So Akiva's right here, because it's saying, hang on, there is a bit of a problem, because this is his fence. So Akiva, you are completely correct. I was waiting for somebody to pick it up. You must come more often. So
and that's why we love you, Akiva.
Yeah, that's why we love having you. So therefore, the Gemara discusses a case where he automatically, when he puts it in the public domain, that part of the fence that's within the public domain, he relinquishes ownership of that. It has to mention that specifically. In other words, give me a sec. In note 35, on the 29th daf in the Schottenstein, Akiva, you'll notice that Rashi does mention there that he would have to relinquish ownership of that portion side that was in the public domain in order for this to work. So you
right, exactly.
So you spot on the mark. Okay, let's just cover a bit of ground. Gav, is it urgent?
No, carry on.
Okay, so so the Gemara reasons why does Rav Yochanan rule that he is not liable if he confines the thorns within his own property? But by the way, he gives a different answer to the Panay Yehoshua, who said, listen, if anybody's coming in your property, if you've got wild dogs or you've got anything that attacks them, they've got no permission to be in your property. The Gemara gives a different explanation. So the explanation that the Gemara gives is as follows. It says, is it not because such a fence is the equivalent of a pit one digs in his own property? Okay, so what do we mean it's not, is it not equivalent to the pit of one digs in his own property? Let me explain to you what that actually means. So, the Torah, when the Torah imposes responsibility for a pit that is in the path of the public, it refers only to a pit that's privately owned. In other words, remember, guys, there were two interpretations of pit from the Torah. The one that said that if you create a public hazard deliberately, like a pit, then you're liable for it, whether you own the pit or not. What defines owning it? Well, you don't own public ground, but you still created a hazard. So those that interpret it like that understand that the Torah is bringing a classic case of a hazard in the public domain. There are other people, there are other sages that say it only refers to a pit that's privately owned. What do we mean privately owned? You dig a pit on your premises and then you declared the premises ownerless, but not the pit ownerless, technically. So if you didn't declare the pit ownerless, then the pit that was in your previous property but is now part of the public, you're responsible if anybody gets injured there. But the Torah doesn't hold anybody responsible for a pit he digs in the public domain because he doesn't own it. So that's where that source comes from. So that applies to if you leave an object in the public domain. So according to this opinion, Akiva, it's basically saying that is it not because such offense is the equivalent of one who digs a pit in his own property, meaning the only reason that he holds a person responsible is exactly the reason the Kibbutz said, is because he still considers the fence his. And therefore, if he relinquishes ownership of the fence, he's not responsible. So Rav Yochanan thereby implies that when the Torah imposes liability for damage caused by pit, it's referring to a pit dug in the public domain. Okay? So it's evident that Rav Yochanan's opinion, one who declares his hazards ownerless is liable. Does that make sense? In other words, it's using the view of saying that he is liable for a pit he dug in the public domain. In other words, any part of the fence that extends in the public domain, he's liable for, but he's not liable for the fence portion that's in his property, because that is not going to relinquish ownership of his property, meaning somebody's broken into his property, and not that part of the fence that's within his property protecting his property. So there's still a contradiction. So the Gemara answers, no, in fact, I can say to you that according to Rav Yochanan, one who declares his hazards ownerless is not liable. And why did Rav Yochanan say that one who confines the thorns of his fence within his own property is not liable? He ruled that because it was stated in regard to that case, and this is where we're coming to Arthur's one that he did, prep work on. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, said, the owner of the fence is not liable because it's not the way of people to rub themselves against walls. Meaning that if you're stupid enough to see a wall made out of sticking out pieces of glass and thorns and you rub yourself against it, you're a moron and you've only got yourself to blame. So therefore, it's not the way of people to actually walk on walls, just like it's not your way to rub your hand on sandpaper. So basically, at this point, the Gemara has reinstated its initial proposal that Rav Yochanan doesn't hold one responsible for ownerless hazards. So it was saying for two reasons. Number one, he's of the opinion that the only hazard you're responsible for is when you still maintain ownership. Like if you had a swimming pool in your property, but you gave up your property but not the swimming pool, you're responsible. But if it's an ownerless hazard like a pit in the public domain, you are not responsible. So then the Gemara raises another challenge. Akiva, it'll make more sense to you if you do Chazorah for on yesterday's show when you get a chance. I hope I'm not confusing you, but I just can't go back to yesterday.
No, it's fine. I'm following.
Okay, so the Gemara raises another challenge, and it says, well, did Rav Yochanan really say this? Because it's saying something doesn't make sense. If he's saying he's not liable for ownerless hazards in the public domain, we learned before, Kev, we learned before that Rav Yochanan, when he was explaining the view of Rav Yehuda, and by the way, Rav Yehuda is the view of the sages, he's saying that unless there's an accidental mishap, you're always responsible for an ownerless hazard. So that's the first clue that's saying that this particular part of the interpretation that Rav Yochanan is saying you're not liable for a ownerless hazard, there's something wrong. But it's going to bring a second brisa as a proof. Because there's an anonymous Mishnah which says that Rav Yochanan has approved, and it says if one digs a pit in the public domain and his ox or donkey falls into it and it dies, he's liable to pay for damages. So the Mishnah, of which Rav Yochanan agrees, states that one is responsible for a pit he dug in the public domain. Hence, Rav Yochanan, who rules in accordance with the anonymous Mishnah, evidently does hold one is responsible for such a pit or an ownerless hazard. Unable to deflect this argument, the Gemara reverses its position. Okay? The Gemara now deals with the source from which it derived above, that Rav Elazar, who maintains the position. Okay, so now we're fighting on one ground. We can see that Rav Yochanan, both in the fact that he explains this case of a qualifiable hazard owner with regards to Rav Yehuda, as well as the view that in this Mishnah he concurs that you're liable if a donkey falls in or an ox falls in and dies in a pit. We can see he holds you liable for an ownerless hazard. But the problem is, last time we left, we ended off with a note that Rav Elazar said in the beginning there are two things that you are responsible for that are ownerless. That is a hazard, an ownerless hazard like a pit, and chametz after 6 hours before the day of Pesach. Okay, so now we've got both people seeming to say that you're liable for an ownerless hazard. Why that can't be is that you wouldn't have two people opposing each other if they have the same opinion. So now we're saying, hang on a second, let's go back to Rav Elazar and see if we can't see what the opinion is. So since Rav Yochanan, it's absolutely clear in the Gemara that he says you're liable for a hazard that is ownerless, it must have been that Rav Elazar said that you're not liable. So what we're trying to interpret is as follows. It says in the Rav Elazar said in the name of Rav Yishmael, there are two things that are not in a person's possession. A pit in the public domain, and obviously the chametz, which indicate that one who declares his hazards ownerless is liable. So Akiva, just to quickly summarize, yesterday, Rav Elazar was quoting his teacher, Rav Yishmael, and said, listen, there's two things you don't own that you're liable for, a pit in the public domain and chametz. When you sell chametz, you still can't derive benefit 6 hours before the Yom Tov comes in, just afternoon. And then also you can't eat the chametz because it's kares, even though you've technically sold it. So he said, just like a pit in the public domain, you don't own it, but you're liable, those two things. So he's saying, listen, it seems to imply that you are liable. The Gemara says there's no contradiction at all. Why? Because he was quoting his teacher, Rav Yishmael, but he doesn't hold by this opinion. Rav Elazar says, you're not responsible for ownerless hazards, in his own opinion, but the opinion of his teacher, of which he was quoting, says you are responsible for ownerless hazards. So we've basically cleared it up. Rav Elazar says you're not responsible. He quotes his teacher as saying his teacher said you are responsible, and we know that Rav Yochanan says you're also responsible for ownerless hazards in the public domain. So just to summarize, and then we're done. Guys, let me see how long we've got. We've got 7 minutes. Just quickly, because I want Kevin to teach us. So in conclusion, the question of whether one is responsible for a hazardous object in the public domain is as follows. So Rabbi Meir rules that you're obligated to pay for any damage, whether you made the object into a hazard accidentally, in other words, you tripped and stumbled, or there was a manufacturing default and the picture disintegrated while in your hand. He said if somebody else got injured, you have to pay for it. And obviously, if you on purpose created a pit in the public domain, there's no question you're liable in that case. The sages, which is, in other words, Rav Yehuda's opinion, maintains that you're not obligated to pay for damages. According to Rav Elazar, the sages don't distinguish between a hazard that's created unavoidably, like if your guy slips and then he breaks his pitcher, or one deliberately created a pit in the public domain. You're not responsible for it. But Rav Yochanan's view of Rav Yehuda and the sages saying you're only released from liability if the hazard was created unavoidably. Otherwise, you're responsible for the hazard, although it's ownerless. All right, guys, we've done this in conclusion. Rav Meir, Thor, you need to teach us now.
Geez, okay.
James, that was awesome, by the way. It was very good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Patti.
Okay. Here we go. Okay. It's a negative commandment not to leave a stumbling block, which is a source of accidents, to one's house.
This would be a more appropriate lesson for what we're learning now.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes, that's fortuitous, eh?
Fortuitous.
It says so in Devarim. Okay, so exactly, not a hazards. People can get injured. So, and that's actually one of the 613 mitzvot. Okay, next one. It's a negative commandment not to destroy any fruit-bearing tree in setting siege. So it says here, when you besiege a city, you shall not destroy its trees, Devarim. This means that not at a siege alone, but rather wherever a person cuts down a fruit tree destructively, he should receive whiplashes. And if anyone breaks a useful object, tears a garment, demolishes a structure, or ruins food destructively, he should be beaten with whiplashes of disobedience by the law of the sages. However, a non-fruit-bearing tree may be cut down even if there is no need for it. And so too, a fruit tree that is aged and produces no fruit except for a small quantity, so that it is not worth troubling over it, which would be less than a quarter of a kav of olives, or a kav of dates. So too, it is permissible to cut down a fruit tree if it has been harming other trees, or because it causes damage to other fields, or because its price, the wood is high. So for the Torah forbade it only as an act of destruction. Because fruit trees, they bear fruit. You're taking a source of food for people. It says the one that bears a small quantity of fruit, that doesn't seem to be a problem. But it's also being destructive and destroying things that are useful for no reason. As I said, I once, Lahavdil, many years ago, I was in a club with a friend of mine in Ilovo. Remember Long Island iced tea?
Yeah.
Gavin, Arthur.
Right,
So,
right.
mate, we were drinking it was like you had to climb up like to the second floor. So a certain individual who you don't know, for fun, he's just dropping glasses down onto Oxford Road. And I said, are you joking? First of all, you hurt someone. It's not why are you destroying someone's property? I mean, and that you could see, he created a bore, like a pit in the public domain, deliberately. How's this? You see how it's, but just to be destructive for no constructive purpose is not allowed.
I agree. By the way, speaking about Long Island iced tea, if you had 1 cup of Long Island iced tea, it equals 1.2 liters, by the way, guys.
Okay, that's the quantity. Okay, should
Exactly
we still have time for another?
1.22 liters, exactly.
Of alcohol or tea?
No, I'm saying it doesn't matter. A cup, a biblical measurement of a cup is 1.222 liters.
Wow, that's a lot.
Okay. Should I continue?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, then now it completely changes tack, changes the course of a completely different subject. It says here, it is a negative commandment not to dwell in the land of Egypt. And it says in Devarim, you shall henceforth return no more to that way. For business and trade, although it is permitted, as there is no prohibition or anything but settling there. Now, moreover, it is forbidden ever to go out of the land of Israel to another land, except to study Torah or to take a wife or to effect a rescue from the heathen. And so one may go abroad for commerce, but to leave in order to live abroad is forbidden. Unless hunger has grown severe there, whoever lives in the land of Israel, his sins are forgiven him. Even if a person walk 4 amot in it, he merits life in the world to come. So too, if one is buried there, all his sins are atoned for. Let a man ever live in the land of Israel, even in a city with a majority of heathens, and let him not live in another land, even if a city has a majority of Jews.
Wow.
For whoever goes out to another country, it is though he worships idolatry. And just as it is forbidden to go out of the land of Israel to another country, so is it forbidden to leave Babylonia for other lands. Okay. So the thing with Egypt, I mean, there were people living in Egypt there, even up to recently, that Jews living there. But to go specifically and live there, I don't know what application this has today, because there, as until recently, was a Jewish community in Egypt, in Cairo, and not many Jews left there, hardly any. So, but to specifically leave there, and also Israel also, unless people, it's for panosa or for learning Torah or for starting a religious school or for panosa, then you can leave Israel. If the